I am so excited to introduce our lab manager for today, Garrick Aden-Buie. Garrick, would you introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, hello. Hi, my name is Garrick. I work at Posit on the Shiny team. I've been on the Shiny team for a little while, um, for probably 3.5 years now, I think.
Nice. Raise your hand if you love and appreciate Shiny. I do. I wore the wrong shirt today. I was wearing my Shiny shirt just yesterday, and I could have shown everybody.
Oh, and I
Well,
have a shiny shirt too.
I know we have bad timing.
Sorry, Eric.
Well, today Garrick is going to be talking to us about agent skills, and maybe their difference between skills and tools, which is something that I have not understood completely. So we will be going over things like what is a skill? What does it look like? If other people have made skills that are useful, where can I find them? How do I know if it's a good one? When do I need a skill? And like, what does creating a skill from scratch look like? Okay, Garrick, I say it is time. Go ahead
All
and share
right.
your screen and let's take it away. We already have a
Yeah.
question from Noor. Noor says, are skills solely for Claude Code or are they applicable in all contexts? I think
That
we are going
is,
to get there, but Garrick's going to be using Claude today.
yeah, I'll actually do a little bit of a couple different things, I
Oh,
think,
good.
to set this up. Um, but first, let me just make sure. So I'm going to be using Positron. And I'm gonna tell it to. So I'm gonna use Positron and yeah, first let's see if everyone can see the screen okay. If you
I
can
think I can. I think it could
a
be
little
like
bigger.
just slightly bigger, especially for the fact that we are recording this on YouTube. And our YouTube
Right.
viewers have told us that the screen is text is slightly too small. Um, but nor to answer your question, skills are not solely for Claude, I believe, right?
That is right. In fact, they're actually kind of technically called agent skills. So more broadly, like they can be used in with basically any coding assistant that supports the idea of skills or the spec for skills. So most at this point, most coding assistants will support skills in some form or another, which includes Claude Code or Posit Assistant or Codex or yeah or Copilot. They all end up supporting skills. Um, So I thought I would start with a pretty basic example to kind of just explore where skills fit into like the general space of how you talk with a model. Um, and so to do this, I was thinking I could use something pretty low level where we don't have uh, any coding assistant in the way. We don't have any. Sometimes the coding assistant we also call that like an agent harness which is really just like the software that, or the sort of programming that we set up around interacting with a large language model. And so I thought maybe it would be interesting just kind of like take all of that away and just do like the most basic things that you can do when you're interacting with large language models. And then we'll build up until we kind of see what a skill looks like, right? So to do this, I'm going to use Elmer, which is the R package for interacting with the APIs for large language models. And if you've ever used Elmer before or haven't seen it before, it basically gives you these nice little functions like Chat Claude or Chat Anthropic, where you can connect directly to an AI provider, right? So I'm going to use Anthropic's Claude Sonnet 4.6 model. And basically, to start a chat, I just run this chat Claude function. You can actually just like, you don't even need to give it a model. Elmer has pretty decent defaults, but here I wanted the latest Claude Sonnet model, right? And then what is really neat about this is that you can run this live console function, and you can actually have like a little conversation in in your chat. And maybe I can like ask, what are agent skills? So this message is going to go, this is me as a user sending a prompt to the model, and then we're going to see the answer coming back from the model, and it writes out a bunch of text. I'll skim really quickly. It tells me that agent skills are capabilities or tools that an AI agent can use to perform tasks, right? Okay, so this was like a question that I was asking. Sometimes the things that you're going to give to the model can be more like in the form of instructions. Like this text that it gave me, this is too many words and it doesn't fit in my screen. I want something a little bit more uh concise. So I'm going to tell it respond terse like smart caveman, all technical substance stay, no fluff. Tell me what are agent skills? And I'll send that. And we're going to get a very different answer this time. This one fits on the whole screen. You can see also there are no emojis anymore. So we just get agent skills equals agent's tools. Skills let agent do things, not just talk. So part of what I have said here is instructions to the model that the model is going to follow in this conversation. And I said, I put these kind of magic words in here, and then I got, an answer that is a bit more, that follows my instructions. It's terse and it contains no filler. And I could ask, follow-up questions. Um, how do I make a skill? Um, Something like this. It can ask a follow-up question. It's going to keep kind of following my instructions, right? Um, okay, so it gets a little annoying to like type these things out. Um, Let me see how I want to. I'm realizing I want to do this slightly differently. So it gets a little bit annoying. I'm going to move this out of the way. So it gets a little annoying to type these things out, especially like instructions like this, where I'm like, just, for this chat, I don't want to like, I want to be able to like open up a chat and have it just start with like, it knows that in these conversations, it should respond terse like a smart caveman, right? And this introduces the idea of a system prompt. So, I can pick the model that I want with Elmer, but I can also I can give it these instructions then to respond like a caveman why did it jump? Um, oh, I need to exit my live demo. Okay, so I can give it those instructions and and if I look at this object, you'll see now I have what's called a system prompt. So the system prompt is basically like a user message, or actually people tend to call it the developer message, which makes a lot of sense. It's a message from the developer, the kind of person like behind the chatbot, and it's kind of like strong instructions about about how the model should behave inside this conversation. And it's sort of like baseline rules for how the conversation should go. So if I've moved that instruction into the system prompt, now I can kind of do the same thing. I can have my conversation. I can ask like, now I don't need to like remind it to be a caveman anymore. I can just say, what are agent skills? And it will now answer me in this short, terse form, right? Um, So this kind of works. Yeah, we're getting like this nice agent reads task, picks skill, passes params. You get this kind of nice terse kind of thing. Um, okay, so these kinds of like you have as a user, you don't often have much access to the system prompt, but if you're programming a chatbot, you have the chance to like introduce these instructions in your system prompt. And for a while, these were kind of like the two like main ways that you would like give instructions to a model, right? But there are definitely problems with putting something like this, these instructions like this into the system prompt. In particular, like maybe not every conversation needs to be in caveman voice, right? Maybe I want to, have moments where I have a normal conversation, and then at some point I, want to like turn on caveman mode, and I kind of want that to happen sort of dynamically, right? So that's kind of the problem that skills are trying to solve is how do we get these sorts of instructions to the model in a way that can be dynamic. It doesn't have to be like pre-programmed into the conversation, but when you're ready for it, it's there for you to use. So um, how it actually works, it kind of builds. Well, actually, let's go look at what a skill looks like. And what this caveman idea comes from an actual skill um, called the caveman skill. And so there's this repo. I'll make this bigger, make it really big. And there's a repo, Julius Brussi, caveman, right? And in there's a skills folder. And under the skills folder, it turns out there's actually, like in this repo, there's a couple skills, but we'll look at the caveman skill first. So this is generally how people organize skills. There's usually a folder called skills. Then the name of the folder is the name of the skill. And then inside of the folder, there's a skill.md file. And it's basically just a markdown file that contains instructions for the model that can be loaded dynamically when the model is ready to bring in the prompt. Um, so, and a couple key pieces of this skill, right? Here's this sentence that I was using. You can see that this is like part of the skill. And and then there's like a whole section. Actually, we'll look at it as code so you can see what the markdown itself looks like. So this is what the file would look like, right? Note, let me scroll back up. Note skills caveman was the name of the skill. And then there's this YAML block at the top of the markdown file. If you've used, Quarto or R Markdown, it's similar to that, where there's a YAML block of metadata at the top of the file. And one sort of quirk of skills is that this name has to match the directory. So that's one thing you have to set up to begin with. But you give your skill a name, and then you also give it a description. And the description it turns out, is a pretty important part of the skill because it is not here just to remind you what your skill is about. It's actually here as instructions. It's like a short snippet of instructions that the model will see that tell it what is inside this skill. So the model will, like the way that skills generally work is like the coding assistant will let the model know that it has some skills. It'll let it know what the names of the skills are, and it'll show it like these couple of lines of text to say, to like give it a hint about when or how it should be using this skill. And in the course of the conversation, um, you'll end up saying something that sort of matches, the user will say something that matches what is in this description. And then the model will go, hey, actually, you know what? I've got a skill for this. And it'll load that skill directly. So you can see this description does a really good job of explaining exactly when the model should use this skill. So it says explicitly use when the user says caveman mode or talk like a caveman or use caveman. Um, in which case it should, the model is being told essentially you should bring in this skill and follow the rest of the instructions. Um, any questions at this point?
Yes, I was just going to say, can I interrupt you? Okay,
Mhm.
we have two questions. One, I'm not sure if we have the answer to. I don't know the answer. Nathan Jeffrey had asked if I have access to Positron Assistant using GitHub Copilot, does that mean that I can use Elmer like without an API key? I don't know the answer to this.
Without an API key, I don't know either. You probably need an API key. Um, that
I
is
think
with
that's the answer.
Yeah, when you're using Elmer, there's an API key behind all of these somewhere, but you can definitely like chat GitHub. There is a chat GitHub, And and I think that this works just because it knows what um, like it knows that I have a GitHub token, in my environment that I use for interacting with GitHub's APIs or installing packages. At one point I set up a GitHub token, and it'll pick it up and give you access to GitHub's models, which may or may not overlap with GitHub Copilot or the specific subscription service that you have. It's all very difficult to figure out exactly. Um, but there's a good chance that yes is the answer.
Okay,
Um,
great. And then we had one from Alexandra that says, can the instructions be more than just strings? Are there other types of sources like JSON or CSV that can be used to learn other skills? And
ye-
if we're going
um,
to get there, then we'll get there. But I think it's a good question.
yes, ish, right? So we'll get into like a little bit more of the structure of the sort of detail. Like you can have more than just one skill markdown file. And there's a concept in skills of progressive disclosure, which is actually something that we've seen already in talking about this description. So skills are designed to be like designed to be set up so that kind of you're not like throwing everything at the model all at once, right? So the system prompt idea is like we're going to fill the system prompt with everything that the model is going to need to know for this entire conversation. And often what happens is it turns out that the model, like you'll put instructions into the system prompt that are completely irrelevant to actual conversations that users are having. And it creates problems because sometimes those instructions may distract the model from paying attention to what the user is saying, or may cause the model to go off and do something that the user doesn't want them to do. But you had instructions in the system prompt that kind of, were telling the model to do something that happens to be at odds with what the user was actually wanting to do, right? And um, so skills are set up to have this progressive disclosure property where, we start by showing the model just this little bit. This is supposed to be like 100 tokens, like say like 100 words, 2 sentences, one paragraph, roughly, right? And the model will see just this. And if it decides that this skill is relevant and loads the rest of the skill, it will load just the rest of the file. And the file usually has, basic instructions and some things that are relevant to, here there's a here there's like really limited. This is a pretty small skill in the sense that, it mostly just says like, you know, stop using filler words and pleasantries and just yeah, and also articles, and it gives it a quick pattern for how to reply. But it also includes, some other follow-ups like drop the caveman act. If you're about to do something destructive, go ahead and explain it clearly to the user instead of pretending to be a caveman. That's a good idea, right? And so there's some instructions here, but also then this skill file can then point to other files that are sort of adjacent to the skill, and the model will, be able to load those as needed as you, um, yeah, load those as needed as it sort of tries to tackle the task at hand.
All right. So if we want our agent to talk like a caveman, this is great. What are the examples in which you use skills?
Right. Um, so I use skills in lots of different ways. Um, Hang on, I'm trying to connect where I was going to go to where that is.
I just like record scratched Garrick's brain, everybody.
Right. Do we want, I mean, okay, yeah, I mean, I use skills in lots of ways. So, I guess we could show you this, which is a collection of skills that are probably a lot more useful to you than the caveman skill. Um, but this is a little repo that I started putting together when skills came out and have been encouraging people to contribute to inside of Posit. And it's a place where I basically store skills that I've created that I find useful in more or less everyday work. And I have we've organized it by like subfolders. So there's whole groups of things. Um, and let's go into the Shiny skill because I know that there are some interesting skills in here. So there's a grouping of Shiny skills, right? And then there's this Shiny BSLib skill. And if I open up this skill, the idea with this skill, if I show you the code, right, is it's a Shiny BSLib is the name of the skill, and then the goal is to help you build modern Shiny dashboards and applications using BSLib. So if I go back to the preview, you can see basically the idea is that this skill should kick in whenever you're building new Shiny apps or you're trying to modernize a legacy Shiny app or you're working with some new features of BSLib like page layouts or grid systems or cards or those kinds of things. So if you're having a conversation, if you have this skill available to your coding assistant and you're also having a conversation about building Shiny dashboards and things, then this skill should kick in and it would basically, help your coding agent forget about some of the things that it knows about writing Shiny apps that only use the Shiny library, and it will bring in the extra stuff that the model needs to know or be reinforced about acting on to write Shiny apps with BSLib instead. And then, so inside of this Shiny BSLib folder, you can see I have a references section. I'm going to see if I can just open that directly. So I have another subfolder next to that called references. And inside of references, there are a whole bunch of different areas, right? So there's things like there's a section on accordions and cards and grid layouts. And so you could think of like if you're building a Shiny app with Shiny and BSLib, maybe so the skill itself is like, here's the most relevant information for anybody who is doing this thing, anybody who is using Shiny and BSLib together. And then the references folder is full of smaller sort of standalone pieces that are then relevant that the model might go read if it needs to, like you're working with filling layouts, right? Filling layouts are notoriously tricky. And maybe you're working with the filling layout in your Shiny app. And so then this file is basically going to explain how filling layouts work to the model. So basically, he's going to just like can load this information on the fly, and all of a sudden just know everything that there is to know about Shiny BSLib and filling layouts. Which
So
reminds
this
me
is
that
so this is in contrast to just freewheeling an LLM and being like, "Hey, I'm building a Shiny app. I want to have this filling layout," and then expecting it to go read the documentation, hope that it reads the right stuff, hope that it figures it out and do it right, right? And then often that doesn't work, spoiler, right? Like it'll come back and it'll do something janky and you're really frustrated and you're like having to do this again. Using a skill is like putting a skill pack into a robot, right? Where you're like, hey, learn how to
yes,
make this for me real quick. And I'm not going to have to explain any of it to you and then go do it and have a way higher likelihood of doing it correctly, right?
yes, yes, exactly. Yeah, and I think reminded us of the I know Kung Fu scene from uh what is the name of this movie? I forgot. It just went out
The
of my brain.
Matrix.
The Matrix, yeah. Right. So it's a little bit like that. Like you just plug your model in and say like, "Hey, you know Kung Fu now." Um, or or it's also like there's the general advice about writing functions where people will say, if you've written the same code 3 times, or you copy and pasted the same code 2 times and you go to do it a third time, maybe that is the time to make a function. And I think a really similar thing applies to skills where if you find yourself saying the same thing to a model repeatedly, like you're having a conversation with Claude, for example, and you are like you find yourself like typing out the same phrase repeatedly, um, or like telling it like, "Yeah, I want you to do it this way," and then you have to like maybe you give like a whole paragraph and if you notice yourself doing that, then that is a great moment to stop and make a skill.
Fantastic. Okay, we have some questions if you're open for a little break. We're
Absolutely.
at the 30-minute mark, so I think this is a good stop because we've got about four questions that we could get through. One is from Russ that says, "Hey, GitHub has the like top 10 repos and trending repositories. Is there anything like that with agents skills so that we can look up the top trending or used skills so that we know what's already out there?" Isabella did link some stuff. I'm wondering what you use to keep up with the latest.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm really excited to share this website with you. It's skills.sh. This is by the company Vercel. They also have a little command line utility. Um, if you have npm installed, you can use npx skills to add any of these skills to your coding agents. I really like the utility, but then also what happens is that they sort of keep track of who's using which skills, and then they have this big sort of, I mean, this is actually like exactly what that person was asking about, where this is like these are the top skills used of all time.
I love how
But you
the
can see
top one
they're
is just find skills.
finding skills. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
I think
very
some of the
meta.
top ones end up being because they're loaded in common, um, what's the word? They're loaded in common coding agents.
Okay.
But yeah, so you
Well,
can from here you can look through things and like I can probably find the caveman skill. There's actually a bunch of caveman things. Um, for example, or we were just looking at Shiny. You can find our skills here. BSLib. Let's see, tidyverse probably shows up. So if you're ever in a position where you're like, I wonder if a skill exists for this thing already, you can come here and search for it. Let me show you. I'll go to the Shiny BSLib one because okay, there we go. So once you open it, you can actually, read through the skill here in the website. At the very top, they'll give you the command that you can paste into a terminal to run to add the skill to your coding agent. And then there's also like a direct link to the repo. They added this
nice.
recently too, these security audits, which I think are useful to look at. And it's worth mentioning that that it is worth auditing a skill before you bring it in to your coding
Yeah. Tom
assistant.
in the Discord literally just asked, should we really trust these rando skills? Somebody had also said, like, hey, I actually don't recommend installing that find dash skills one because it comes with a bunch of telemetry. So do your
Yep.
research still, right? Like verify that
Yes.
what you are adding to your computer is good. Thank you, Russ, for that question. And then we had one from Santiago asked in the Zoom Q&A. Santiago, get on Discord. We miss you. What tool do you use to download slash manage or sync skills from various sources? He says that he is using NPX skills from Vercel, but curious to hear what everybody else is using. Is NPX what you use, Garrick?
Yeah. So I use NPX mostly. One of the things I like about NPX is let's try it. Where did we'll put this thing over here. So I'll make this bigger. We'll hide the console. I'm gonna CD into demo and okay, so you do NPX skills add and then you give the repo. And when you run this, it will tell you which skills are in that repo, and then you can pick them. I could say like, I want this skill, and maybe I want it, yes, I want it in Claude Code, and you pick a couple options, like I'm going to put it here in this project, and I just say yes to everything else. Also, like this will show you the security risk assessment as well. So you'll actually see that in the output. And what it has done is it has, if I can find this folder, it has added the skill source to .agents/skills. In It wasn't clear in here, but in when I for this question, which agents do you want to install to? I have picked Claude and Pi before, so it remembered that and it installed symlinks to Claude skills and to Pi skills, and so that they would be available for those coding agents. And then the last thing it does is it adds this file. I'll hide the console. Adds this file which keeps track of where I got this skill from, which this is pretty useful in general. Um, the other way that I like to install skills is using a package that I work on called BTW. So if you load BTW, there is also a function BTW skill, and you can install skills from GitHub, or you could install skills from packages. So if you are developing R packages, my recommendation is to store, let's see if this is actually in here. So the to store skills in the inst skills directory, and then the BTW package will basically like see that, and you can install the skill from the package directly, which means then make it available to other coding agents outside of Elmer and BTW. Or there's also a way that BTW can give you an Elmer client that can see skills and use skills, and and it will automatically detect skills in your attached R packages. So like if you've loaded a package that also has a skill, then the BTW client will automatically load that for you.
Awesome. Okay, let's see if we can slide in a few more questions here. James had said that caveman skill had a boundaries section in it. Is that standard for the skills.md file, and what practical implications does that have?
It had a boundary.
It might have had like a boundaries. There you go at the very end.
Oh, right. Okay, so the funnest part about skills is that inside of the markdown file, anything goes. Like write anything. This is just a thing that they added here. I think it makes sense. This is relevant um, to like if you're using this skill, that's pretty relevant. Like don't the idea here is like it's telling the model like there's certain cases where you don't want to be uh, extremely terse, and it is better to actually make sure everyone knows what you're talking about.
Yes, I think
But
caveman talk would get pretty annoying in certain situations.
yes.
Um, Morgana asked, are skills almost a way to give agents info about topics in a lesser version of having a vector store or a document repo for the model to refer to? So it's like a master class version of the info, maybe a more succinct version.
Yeah, I think okay, so when would you use RAG, or which is what they're talking about? RAG is retrieval augmented generation, and it's the idea that so this is very similar in the sense that in both cases, retrieval augmented generation and skills are both like we're going to need to get some useful information in front of the model. We're going to load it dynamically because we don't know when exactly it is supposed to be used. But RAG is more about having a giant pile of documents that may or may not be relevant, and you don't at any given point know which one is going to be relevant to any conversation. Skills are a lot better when you enter an area where there's a very clear reason that you would want to have the skill be loaded in the first place. So, if we go back to the Shiny example, um, the the skill here is like when you're building Shiny apps that use BSLib, then we know like once we know that, we now know everything in here is more or less relevant. Um, and this is like we'd want this to come in, right? Or the other way that this is really useful is when you have a specific workflow that you want to go through, when you want to guide the model through doing something very specific. And I have another example of that in here. Where did or do I have, thought, no, it moved around. Okay, so. Yeah, there it is. So PR create. So this is a skill that I made at one point for that kind of like monitor follows how I like pull request, like how I like pull request. So if I'm working with a coding assistant and I've made some changes and I'm at the point where I'm like, okay, this is ready to be made into a pull request. This then covers more or less the workflow that I would use, and specifically with Claude Code. So this, you can skills can be used with lots of different coding assistants, but in this case, I've mentioned specific tools that I know Claude Code has that other coding agents don't necessarily have. So I designed this skill around guiding Claude through a very specific workflow. And you can see that inside of these instructions, um, it's very prescriptive. It's like, here's what you're going to do. Here's the process. Step one, you're going to look at the current state and you're going to figure out like where our base branch is. There's stuff in here like maybe you're going to want to like you're going to need to either create a branch or you'll have to stage and commit the changes, or maybe you're going to need to get the branch up to speed with the latest version of main, things like that. And then getting through specific, like, this is how I want you to draft the PR title and body, right? So this is much more prescriptive. It's very like you're entering an area of like, we're going to do this task together. And I, you know, by the time you've like scanned this whole thing, you're like, I would not want to guide the model through all of these pieces, step by step. I really like, I know how I want this process to go from the outside, and I just want the model to pick up the pattern that I have established and follow it for me. And so that's how I ended up using um this skill a lot. Is it just sort of now Claude and I follow a repeatable pattern when I'm submitting a PR. And
Perfect.
yeah,
And
it's really nice.
I liked Notebeko in Discord saying it's like making sentient functions.
It is exactly like that. That is such a
I
good
really, really like
analogy.
that. That's a perfect description. Okay, so there are more questions, but we have 20 minutes left, and you were going to help us see what building a skill from scratch looks like. And so if we're going to
Yeah,
fit that in, I say
we
we
would
go
need
for
to do
it.
that now. Yeah.
Let's do it. And we
Okay.
will still hold some space, maybe like 5 minutes at the end, and we'll get in as many questions as we can, or we will answer them in Discord.
Yeah. So I was working that demo. Where did I put you? Report. So I have, this should be everything. So I have this report that I was working on using this week's Tidy Tuesday data. And I actually worked on this together with Opus and Posit Assistant. And we went through a bunch of stuff. I made this whole report looking at the data. I'm just going to scroll down. You're going to see there's some plots. There's another plot. But my favorite plot is the last one, which explores the tariffs that that the US government applies to cheeses. And apparently, we apply higher tariffs to cheese that we think is fancier. So, uh, my favorite part was Swiss with holes. Swiss cheese with holes gets a higher tariff than Swiss cheese without holes, which is higher than cheddar cheese, for example. Um, okay, so we made this whole thing. If I can find the code somewhere in here, it'll be something like here's our official cheese ranking, right? If I open this up and looked at it in a browser, I would realize that this plot does not have alt text. So alt text is basically a description for uh, for uh, people who like either can't see the plot because of their system or a visual disability. And the idea is that it describes what is happening in this image. So it'd be nice to have something. And the way that you can do it is here to do like fig. So in Quarto, you do the fig alt, and you can see now that actually Copilot is going to give me a pattern here, bar chart showing US tariff rates for different types of cheese with annotations. This is probably this is like a very literal, like what happened is the completion model read this code and was like, I think I get what's going on here, and just gave me a basic answer, right? But there are some really good processes to follow. Um, in particular, this um, there's an article on Medium. I forget the author's name at the moment, but it's in this in the README for this repo. Who kind of went through like, here's a really good pattern that you can follow. So, chart type of type data where reason for including chart, and then make sure you include a link to the source data source somewhere in the text. So I have already kind of gone through and picked out. I need to see this in regular. So I've picked out some good resources on creating alt text. Amy Sissel is the author of that Medium article, by the way. And what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to open up a terminal, and I'm going to actually move this over so we have it side by side. This is my favorite part of Positron, by the way, that you can just like grab things and move them around and put them next to each other. Um, and I'm going to launch Claude. We're going to use Sonnet 4.6, and I'm going to invoke a skill. So this is the other way that you can invoke skills is with the slash command. You can see here's my PR create skill because Claude knows that I like this skill and use it a lot. So in Claude Code, skills show up as slash commands. You just type slash and then you can type the name of the skill. And or the other way that skills kind of get loaded is when you say words that sort of match what was in the description, and then it'll show up in it'll either one can work. But I like the slash command because I know when I'm getting the skill that I want. So I'm gonna actually use the skill creator skill to create a skill. And you can invoke the skill. The other cool part is you can say more words too. So like let's create a skill for hang on, I'm gonna do it this way, see if this works. Let's create a skill for writing alt text for data visualizations. That did not.
Oh, what did you just do?
I
Were you
tried,
dictating?
I was dictating because that's, nope. Okay, hang on. All right, I'm going to just type it out. It should have worked, but it didn't because Zoom is probably in the way. Let's
Because
create a
Zoom, I
skill.
know it ruins everything. I did a 2 week trial, everybody, of the whisper flow that Joey Marshall showed us on his data science lab. And I really liked it. There were some instances in which it would like take over when I didn't want it to, where I would accidentally click it and I would end up dictating dead air for like 15 minutes. But it was pretty cool. We're
Yeah.
having a
I,
fight in the chat right now about cheese. We got really sidetracked by the cheese. So everybody
awesome.
pay attention. We're making a skill because we have 13 minutes to make this skill.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I said, yeah, make me a skill. And I give it these websites and asked it to distill the references into concrete advice. And I, this is a pattern that I like to follow when I'm making a skill is basically like go open a bunch of tabs, go browse around, find good resources. Like either that could be, package documentation, things that you have written already, things that other people have written, people whose advice admire and appreciate, things like that. Like if you do a little bit of work in advance to say, sort of bring in some like good resources and materials for the skill, it generally goes a whole lot better, right? So Claude went out and read those websites and said, now I have everything I need. Let's write this skill. And I'm going to say, yeah, it wants to make the .claude skill and is going to call it alt text dataviz. And I'm going to say, yeah, go ahead. You can have access to skills. Feel free. And so now it's probably going to do a bit more reading. Basically, the skill creator skill is just going to walk it through all the things that it needs to do from here. Often, if you have done the hard work of putting together some good context, your that's kind of the extent of what you need to do for now, at least. Like,
Okay, so while Claude is incubating, maybe we can get another question in.
yeah.
Because Connor asked a great one. I love this. How do LLMs deal with conflicts between skills, like the dplyr select and mass select conflict, but with LLM skills?
I mean, so that's the nice part about it being like sentient functions is that the model figures it out to a certain extent. Also, like you likely won't have two skills loaded at the same time. So usually with the skill, it'll be like I said, the model has a general sense of what each skill is, but then it actually has to go and to like actually like get the contents of the skill and bring it in. It has to like it has to take an action to do that. It has to go read the file, and that doesn't happen automatically. So it's very rare that you end up in a situation where like you have competing skills active at the same time. In fact,
Yeah,
the
and
hardest part about a skill is that they don't always turn on when you want them to turn on.
I was going to say, Nor had asked a sort of like question that goes along with that, which was like, well, are you stuck using all skills for each session, or can you like subset which skills you're using for that session? Um, Part of the answer to that, I think, is that that's why we give them descriptions, right? So that it's not initially just reading every skill that you have, it's only reading that description part.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you with skills, there is no real way for you to like go in and toggle. Usually there isn't any way for you to like toggle skills on or off. Your only real choice is whether or not you install it for globally on your computer. So like for any session with Claude, or if you install it just for the project that you're working on. And beyond that, there's not a lot of there aren't a lot of levers to pull about when which skill is attached or not attached or like available. But
Okay. I think that
skills
that
are
answers Nathan's question,
yes.
which was, is the default to download them on a per project level?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I usually opt for doing skills locally first. And then if I realize that I use them so much that I need them, that they're like useful to be global, then I move them and start using them globally.
Okay. What is the difference between those two options? Like, could you demonstrate that for
Yeah,
us really quickly?
sure. So Claude just made me a skill and it put it in .claude skills, right? And so I'm in this project. And if I go in here to inside of my project, I have .claude skills. And here's my alt text data viz skill, right? Which we can come back to, but it made me a skill. We have a skill now. This is awesome. Um, Yeah, you can do the skill. So the other option is to install it into my home directory. There in my home directory, there is also .claude/skills. And there, that those skills are then available everywhere, right? So, I was talking about the PR create skill, which is not here in my project, but it is available to me because um, it's a skill that I have installed globally. So any coding session that I do will have PR create. Any coding session with Claude Code will have PR create. And meanwhile, like this alt text data viz thing will only be here in this project.
Okay. I interrupted you in the middle of a thought when I asked you that question. Do you remember what you were going to say?
No, but that's all right. So I have my alt text data viz skill now, and I from here I mean, okay, here's what's nice is it actually did, see that it found this from the picture, right? That was the pattern that we were wanting it to have. Um, I we're not going to read this and like go through it in great detail or anything like that, but I would recommend if you are making your own skill, don't just take the output from Claude at this point. I mean, I can say that this skill is definitely better because I gave it three really good articles than it would be if I just asked Claude to make up a skill without any references, right? So we're already starting off on a good foot, but if you're making your own skill, this is the point where I would stop, read this, uh, like actually I would read it line by line. Oh, do you want to see something else that's cool that I really like? Um, I have
Absolutely, we do.
Um, so
I
I have
see
a,
other questions coming in. I'm just gonna let you guys know if we don't get to them in the last 7 minutes, we will answer them on Discord. Don't worry.
yeah, so it's Claude, skills, alt, text, data viz, skills, ND. Never mind. Why did
What were
I
you typing? It was enigmatic.
need Claude? Like did I spell something wrong? Maybe this one. I have this, it's like a skill slash plugin that lets me um, review files. So I could like see, it looks a little bit like this. I'm gonna hide some of this so it like gives you the file from like you start from Claude Code. It's called Planetator. And then you can, where's my skill? This is the one, right? Then you can highlight parts and add comments and say, like, this looks great. Thanks for writing it. Or you can, give it instructions on specific lines too. I think like if I click here, yeah, I could give it inline feedback. And when I'm done, then you can click approve or close and you send that inline feedback back to the model and the model will respond to you directly. So like if you're interacting with like a markdown file, unlike doing it over here in the editor, that little interface is pretty nice for letting you give inline, like very specific feedback inline. But
That is super cool. Victor, thanks for sharing that in the chat.
so now you'll notice I don't have the skill yet because I need to like exit this session and start a new one. And now I have the alt text data viz skill, and I can say add appropriate alt text to the plots in, and I'm going to use at so I get the right. So the at is going to say like here's the file, like here's a file that I want you to use. And I think I put it in report. I can pick the QMD from here. Um, we must have moved directories while we were doing that, which is probably why that command wasn't working before. But so that
That's okay.
so I've invoked the skill. I invoked it directly rather than I could have just said write some alt text for me, and it probably would have also turned on. But this also will work for me as well. And you can see it's going through and adding these the appropriate chunk options to include useful alt text. And again, I would not recommend just taking this, but it is a really good starting point for you to make it easier to like write these and have them be part of your reports.
I
Um,
agree. They're a great starting place. Look at them, look at the plot, verify, but then they often cut down on time and make it way more likely that you actually add alt text, which is very important for accessibility.
exactly.
Okay, we have 3 more minutes. Can we like rapid fire get in some questions
Absolutely.
and answers? Okay. We had from Zoom a question that said, I use the Posit skills and I install it from Claude Code plugin marketplace and provide the Posit skills Git URL. Is this the same thing with installing with NPX? Does it do the same thing?
It's very similar. Claude has its own plugin system. What they're talking about is, and it's mentioned in the repo of the Posit Skills repo, but you do like something like plugin install or add or something, and so like I have it set up so that in the skills repo there are like groups of skills and you can install them as Claude Code plugins, which makes it easier to manage if you're just using Claude Code. I move around a little bit between coding assistants, so I prefer installing individual skills, and I also really like having a lock file. So I don't, I'm not a huge fan of Claude Code's plugin system, but they both work. So
Okay,
we tried to
cool.
make it easy so that you could get like some skills, but not all the skills at once.
All right. I also wanted to point out David Onder had said in the chat that he actually keeps his skills in folders that are named by group names and tells the AI to use skills by group, which I think is pretty useful if you're thinking about organizing. We also had Nathan Jeffrey ask a question along those lines, which is, What distinguishes the .claud folder from a .agents folder?
It's just convention. For different agents, we'll use different folders. Agents is the most sort of coding assistant agnostic one, and then Claude Code uses .claud, and there are a bunch of different ones. Like some coding agents will follow the .agents, and some will not, or some use their own conventions. Um,
Okay.
yeah, it's the Wild West out here.
All right. And then I think our last one is from Zoom, and it says, is it the community practice to let an LLM write the skill with resources fed as opposed to writing it by hand?
Uh, yes and no. I think it depends a bit on what you want to do. Like, and it depends on your task and everything. I think that the vast majority of skills that you will find online have been written by Claude Code or, by a coding agent in the first place.
I think
Um,
so too. I see that a lot.
yeah. And on the other hand, like things that are, you can still do it by hand and have bespoke skills that are very important to you. And it's a useful experience. But overall, I do recommend, I think the most important part is to think about what sources you're putting in front of the model. And you also, like I did not do this, but usually I spend quite a bit of time guiding the model in terms of how to structure the information. So I don't usually just take what it gives me in terms of what it thinks it should be. I work on structuring the information in a way that will likely be better organized in the end as a result of my participation. And then you read it, and then you make it, fix it up until it's what you want it to be.
All right,
I
Garrick,
have
this
one more
was so
thing.
great. We are at the top of the hour, but if
Um,
it's really quick, get it in there and we'll get it in
it
the
is super
YouTube
quick, which is
recording.
also if you see someone else's skill that you think is like, this is great, but it's not quite what I want, remix the skill. Bring it
Yeah.
in, change it up, remix it, make it your own.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Garrick. I learned a ton. I see, oh, hey, Donnie, Donnie's here. Everybody's clapping in Zoom. You're getting tons of thank yous in the Discord. I will say thank you too. This was amazing. We will have this up on YouTube. And I really hope that you had a good time too, Garrick.
I had a blast. Thank you so much.